In a prominent church in France, Rema, a nun known for her vehement criticism of Islam, served as a symbol of staunch religious loyalty. For years, she publicly denounced Muslims, portraying them as dishonest and their faith as fundamentally flawed. In her mind, Christianity was the sole, undeniable truth, and she made it her mission to convince others of the same. Her passionate speeches and strong convictions inspired her community, but they also sowed division. Her words emboldened many to shun their Muslim neighbors and deepened cultural and religious divides. It seemed that Raima's disdain for Islam was unshakable, but then something unexpected happened, something that not only silenced her fiery rhetoric, but led her down a path she never imagined. After years of inciting others against Islam, Raima experienced an event that would ultimately cause her to leave her position at the church. The details of what occurred became the talk of the town, spreading beyond the walls of her local parish and capturing attention across France. Videos surfaced, recounting her transformation, and people were left wondering how a woman so entrenched in her beliefs could make such a dramatic change. What caused her to shift from being a critic of Islam to embracing it as her own faith? According to Rema, it was a series of personal experiences, events that felt to her like miracles, that began to challenge everything she thought she knew. These weren't just fleeting moments or coincidences, they were occurrences that deeply unsettled her, forcing her to question her long-held views. Raima, once a resolute advocate for Christianity and an outspoken critic of Islam, found herself re-examining her stance, her faith, and ultimately her place in the world. What could have been so profound as to turn a voice of opposition into a voice of acceptance? That's what so many asked as her story unfolded. It wasn't a grand debate or a public challenge that changed her heart. It was something deeply personal and unexpected. The details remained elusive, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary conversion. Raima's journey was one that surprised not just those who knew her, but even herself. From the time she first set foot in the church at the age of 15, Raima had always been outspoken. Over the years, her fiery rhetoric against Muslims became her hallmark. Her speeches were relentless, filled with accusations and doubts about the authenticity of Islam. Raima firmly believed that Christianity was the only true religion, and she used every opportunity to convince others that Islam was misguided and false. When large congregations gathered, Raima's sharp words would echo through the church. She claimed that Muslims were dishonest, that their faith was fabricated, and that they posed a threat to true believers. Her messages reached beyond the church walls, influencing the community around her. Parents who once allowed their children to play with Muslim neighbors began to separate them, drawing lines that hadn't been there before. Young children who didn't understand the complexities of faith started calling Muslim peers derogatory names, all because of Raima's influence. Despite the impact she had on her followers, Raima herself was never at peace. She often struggled with a lingering restlessness. No matter how many speeches she gave or how many arguments she won, there was a sense of dissatisfaction that wouldn't go away. She would pace her room at night, unable to sleep, even after a day of fervent preaching. Her unease only deepened as the years went on. Some people saw her as a crusader, a fearless defender of Christianity. Others began to question why she seemed so obsessed with Islam. They wondered if her animosity came from a place of personal hurt or misunderstanding. But Raima never shared such thoughts. To her, the mission was clear: expose Islam as false and keep her congregation firmly rooted in their beliefs. Yet, behind her unwavering public stance, a storm was brewing inside her, a restlessness that would eventually lead her down a path she never expected. One evening, after delivering an impassioned speech to a large congregation, Rayma returned to her room feeling satisfied. She had spent the better part of the day warning her audience about what she saw as the dangers of Islam, reinforcing her belief that Christianity was the only path to salvation. Exhausted, she lay down and soon fell asleep. But that night, something unusual happened, something that would repeat itself and haunt her every night after. In her dream, Rayma found herself sitting in the church, but it wasn't the peaceful sanctuary she knew. Instead, it was dark and foreboding. She sat before a shadowy figure who glared at her with piercing eyes. This figure, faceless yet overwhelmingly present, loomed over her. She tried to explain herself to justify her words and actions, but the figure didn't listen. Instead, it turned away, and suddenly 2 others appeared. They reached down, scooping up handfuls of mud from the ground, and smeared it across her face. Rayma's cries for forgiveness echoed in the stillness, but no one answered. She woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. Dismissing it as just a bad dream, she brushed it aside and continued her usual routine. But the dreams didn't stop. Each night the same scenario played out: the shadowy figure, her pleas for understanding, and the humiliation of having mud smeared on her face. The more these dreams occurred, the more they unsettled her. Rayma began to wonder if they were more than just dreams. Were they a sign? A warning? Her restlessness grew. She spent hours sitting in the quiet of the church, praying for clarity. Why were these dreams plaguing her? What did they mean? Rayma, who once spoke so confidently about truth and falsehood, found herself lost in uncertainty. For the first time, she couldn't explain what was happening, and that terrified her. As the dreams continued to disturb her nights, Rayma began to question the very foundation of her beliefs, sensing that something beyond her understanding was at play. Rayma's restless nights soon took a toll on her. The constant repetition of the dreams left her shaken, and she found herself longing for a sense of peace that seemed increasingly out of reach. One evening, unable to bear the weight of her unease any longer, she went to the church late at night, seeking solitude. The grand hall was empty, the dim light of the chandeliers casting long shadows across the pews. Rayma stood at the altar, closed her eyes, and began to pray with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. "God," she whispered, her voice trembling, "show me the truth. If I've strayed, guide me back. I don't understand these dreams. I don't understand what's happening. Please, reveal the path I'm meant to take." Her words were raw, her plea desperate. For hours she remained there, tears streaming down her face as she begged for clarity. Day after day she returned to the same spot, repeating her prayers, hoping for a sign, a moment of insight that would ease her troubled heart. Then, on the 10th night, something unexpected occurred. As she knelt in prayer, the church was suddenly plunged into darkness. The faint glow of the chandeliers vanished, leaving only silence and shadows. Rayma froze, her breath caught in her throat. The stillness was unnerving, but then she noticed a faint light emanating from one of the stained glass windows. It wasn't the soft hues she was used to. It was a brilliant, otherworldly glow that seemed to pulse with life. As she turned her gaze toward the window, Rayma saw words shimmering in the light. They weren't in the familiar Latin script of the church's hymns, nor were they French. They were Arabic. A chill ran down her spine, for she understood Arabic well enough to read the message. The words spoke of the one who created the heavens and the earth, of a single unchanging truth. Rayma's heart raced as she struggled to comprehend what she was seeing. How could these verses, so completely out of place, suddenly appear in this sacred Christian space? Her mind spun with questions. Was this the sign she had prayed for, or something else entirely? The darkness lingered, and Rayma sat in silence, feeling the weight of those glowing words and the new questions they brought. As the church remained cloaked in darkness, Rayma's heart pounded. Her eyes remained fixed on the illuminated verses before her, glowing in a language that should not have been there. The church walls, long adorned only with Christian symbols and inscriptions, now bore Quranic verses. Raima, who had spent her life denouncing Islam, couldn't believe what she was seeing. She approached the wall, hesitant yet drawn in by the inexplicable sight. Her breath caught as she read the words. They spoke of a single creator, the Lord of the heavens and the earth, and the unity of all creation. These were not phrases she had encountered before, and their depth startled her. It was as if the very structure of the church was now speaking a language that challenged everything she had stood for. Raima knew the church well. No Arabic inscriptions had ever been carved or painted here. She reached out, her hand trembling, but the glowing letters seemed almost untouchable, bright yet immaterial. In a state of shock, she turned and stumbled toward the church's library. It was one of the oldest parts of the building, a place filled with dusty tomes and ancient manuscripts. Perhaps, she thought, she could find an explanation there. But as she entered the library, the light returned as suddenly as it had vanished. The chandeliers flickered back on, casting their warm glow over the room, and the unsettling silence was replaced by the faint creaks of the old floorboards under her feet. Raima paused, glancing back over her shoulder toward the church walls. The glowing verses were gone. Still, the words remained imprinted in her mind. She couldn't shake their meaning. How had they appeared? Why would they show up here, of all places? She sat down at a nearby table, her hands still trembling. Though the library felt calm and familiar, the questions racing through her thoughts were anything but. Raima realized that she was now confronting something beyond her comprehension, something that might change the course of her life forever. Raima, shaken by the sudden appearance of the verses, tried to calm herself by scanning the shelves of the church library. Her eyes moved across rows of books she had seen countless times before. The library, known for its extensive collection of Christian theological texts, had always been a source of comfort and familiarity. Yet tonight the space seemed different. Raima felt an unease, as though something hidden within these walls was calling out to her. Her gaze stopped at a particular book she didn't recall noticing before. Its spine gleamed faintly under the dim light, a rich golden cover that stood out among the well-worn tomes surrounding it. Raima hesitated, her fingers lingering just above the book. Its title, embossed in elegant Arabic script, read, "The Quran." She furrowed her brow, confused. How could this book be here, in a place where only Christian texts were stored? Who could have placed it on these shelves without anyone noticing? Raima finally lifted the book, feeling the smooth, cool surface of the cover under her fingertips. It was heavier than she expected, as though it carried more than just physical weight. She sat down and opened it, skimming through the pages. The words were written in Arabic, a language she had learned during her early years of study, and she recognized verses similar to the ones she had seen glowing on the church wall. The book seemed untouched, its pages pristine. How had it gone unnoticed for so long? Her thoughts raced. Had someone deliberately placed it there as a test? Was it a sign she had prayed for? Raima closed the book for a moment and pressed her palms against her temples, as if to quiet the whirlwind of questions. It was undeniable that the presence of the Quran in the church library was deeply unsettling, yet strangely captivating. She felt drawn to its words, the same words she had often criticized without truly understanding them. Raima sat alone in the silent library, staring at the Quran. For years, she had spoken so confidently about her faith, her certainty unshaken. But now, as she held this unexpected book, she felt something shift. It was not a conversion, not yet, but a stirring curiosity that would not be ignored. Raima took the Quran back to her private room, her mind buzzing with thoughts. She had always considered herself well-versed in religious doctrine and firm in her convictions. Yet, holding this book in her hands, she felt a mix of apprehension and determination. She convinced herself that reading it would serve a purpose, to strengthen her arguments against Islam. If she could find passages that proved her long-standing claims about the superiority of her own faith, she could return to her congregation more assured than ever. She set the Quran on her desk, opened it, and began to read. At first, her approach was purely critical. She scanned each verse, searching for contradictions, for statements she could challenge, for anything that might bolster her case. Raima's initial attitude was combative, her intent not to learn but to refute. She believed that with each page she turned, she would find evidence that Islam was misguided, that the faith she had spent so many years opposing was deeply flawed. But as she read on, something unexpected happened. The verses weren't filled with the errors or inconsistencies she had anticipated. Instead, they seemed carefully constructed, presenting concepts she hadn't considered. Many of the ideas resonated with a sense of logic and clarity. She found herself pausing, rereading certain passages, not to critique them, but because they spoke to questions she hadn't even realized she had. Questions about life's purpose, about creation, and about the nature of God. Hours passed, yet Raima barely noticed. What had started as an effort to disprove Islam was becoming something entirely different. She didn't yet acknowledge it, but her perspective was shifting. The Quran's words began to challenge her long-held assumptions, not by force, but by quietly offering answers to doubts she had never voiced aloud. Each verse seemed to peel back a layer of her preconceived notions, leaving her both unsettled and intrigued. By the time she closed the book, Raima was no longer sure what she would say to her congregation. She had not found the ammunition she'd hoped for. Instead, she had discovered a source of knowledge that demanded her attention. She would return to the Quran again, not to criticize, but to seek more of the clarity it seemed to offer. As Raima continued reading the Quran, she found herself immersed in a world of ideas that challenged her long-held beliefs. Initially, she approached the text with skepticism, expecting to find material that would reinforce her negative views. Instead, she encountered something unexpected: answers to questions that had lingered in her mind for years. Passages describing the order of the universe, the purpose of human life, and the nature of the Creator struck a chord she hadn't anticipated. What stood out most was the clarity and logic of the verses. They didn't clash with her reasoning. Rather, they seemed to offer a harmonious perspective on topics she had once found confusing. She began to see how the Quran addressed fundamental human concerns, issues of justice, morality, and the interconnectedness of creation. The more she read, the more her curiosity grew. By this point, Raima was no longer reading out of a desire to criticize. She genuinely wanted to understand the messages within the text. The Quran's call for self-reflection and its emphasis on seeking knowledge resonated with her deeply. It didn't demand blind acceptance. It encouraged her to think, question, and explore. This approach stood in stark contrast to the rigid dogmas she had encountered in other religious teachings. As days turned into nights of reading, Raima found herself drawn closer to a truth she had previously rejected. The Quran's eloquence and coherence made her question why she had dismissed it so readily before. What she had once seen as foreign and incompatible now felt familiar and enlightening. Her feelings of doubt began to shift into a quiet sense of wonder. Raima's transformation didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process, one page at a time, one verse at a time. Each night she returned to the Quran, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to learn more. The woman who had once been so certain in her opposition now found herself captivated by the very text she had sought to refute. In this quiet journey of discovery, Raima realized she was no longer the same person. Her perspective had changed, and with it, her heart began to open to a new understanding. In the weeks following her transformative journey through the Quran, Rema began to experience an internal shift that was impossible to ignore. Her initial doubts about Islam had been replaced by a deep and growing conviction. Everything she once opposed now seemed to hold answers she hadn't found elsewhere. For someone who had spent years publicly denouncing Islam, this new understanding was as unexpected to her as it would be to everyone around her. Rima knew that her decision wouldn't just be a personal matter. It would send shockwaves through her community. The very people she had influenced against Muslims would be confused, even angry. Her colleagues in the church would likely reject her, and her family might disown her. Yet, despite the risks, she felt compelled to make her faith known. The announcement came one Sunday morning, when the church congregation had gathered as usual. Rima, standing at the pulpit where she had so often spoken harshly about Islam, now addressed the crowd in a calm yet resolute voice. She began by recounting the series of events that had led her to question her beliefs, the dreams, the mysterious Quranic verses, and her subsequent journey of reading and reflection. The audience, stunned into silence, watched as she spoke not with the aggression of her former sermons, but with the quiet conviction of someone who had found a profound truth. "I can no longer ignore what I have learned," Rima said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I have come to understand that Islam is not what I once believed it to be. It is not a faith to fear or disparage. It is a faith that has given me clarity and answers to the questions I've carried for so long. Today, I stand before you as someone who has embraced Islam." The reaction was immediate. Some members of the congregation gasped, others whispered among themselves, and a few got up and left. Her closest colleagues, the very people who had once supported her fervent anti-Islamic views, sat in stunned disbelief. Even those who had admired her confidence and conviction now looked at her with confusion and skepticism. Rima, however, remained composed. She knew her decision would be met with resistance, yet she also knew she couldn't keep this transformation to herself. She had found peace, and no matter the consequences, she was determined to live out her newfound faith. When Rima's announcement reverberated through the congregation, it left her colleagues and friends searching for an explanation. They knew her to be a steadfast critic of Islam, someone who had spent years using her voice to warn against its teachings. For her to now stand as a Muslim seemed impossible. Whispers filled the church as people tried to piece together what had happened. The community demanded answers, and many dismissed her story as an emotional whim, a passing phase that would soon fade. Rima, however, held her ground. She spoke of the moments that led her to Islam, the dreams that haunted her, the Quranic verses appearing on the church wall, and the mysterious Quran she had discovered in the library. She described her nights of prayer, her relentless search for the truth, and the profound clarity she found in the Quran's words. To her, these experiences were undeniable, signs she couldn't ignore. In the days that followed, some members of the congregation insisted on examining the church's security footage. They hoped to find logical explanations, something to disprove Rima's account. The church staff retrieved the recordings from the night she claimed the verses appeared. They scoured the footage from the library, trying to pinpoint the moment the Quran appeared on the shelf. To their surprise, while the cameras clearly showed Rima walking through the church and entering the library, the supernatural occurrences she described, the glowing verses, the sudden appearance of the Quran, were nowhere to be found. For the church's senior clergy, this absence of visual evidence confirmed their doubts. They dismissed Rima's account, labeling it a figment of her imagination. But for Rima, the lack of recorded proof didn't diminish her faith. In fact, it strengthened her resolve. She had witnessed something that could not be captured on film. It wasn't about convincing others anymore. It was about following the truth she had found, even if she had to walk that path alone. As more questions and criticisms arose, Rima responded not with defensiveness, but with quiet certainty. "I know what I experienced," she said. "Whether you believe me or not, I know that I found the truth I was searching for." Her unwavering confidence and calm demeanor left even her harshest critics unsure of how to respond.